Okay, all right. All right. Let's do some reading. Let's do some cretin. Chapter 5, Drain the Barrel, Early Modern Malcontents. The reception of cynicism splits further into competing, mutually incompatible elements as Diogenes makes his appearance on the cultural stage of the Renaissance. The rediscovery of Greek literature during that period, including the transition of Laertes' work into Latin by around 1433, provided new sources through the ancient cynicism, which ancient cynicism might be understood. To put it in Cynic terms, the Renaissance afforded a proper dog's breakfast arrival interpretations. There was not a complete break between medieval and Renaissance images of cynicism. Since the Renaissance continued to feed off medieval writings, it inherited the ambivalent attitude towards cynicism of pagan and early Christian writers. Towards cynicism of pagan and early Christian writers where in the later case positions ranged between Jerome's celebration of Cynic's self-restraint in the late 4th century to Augustine's incredulity in the early 5th century before the ridiculous indecency of Cynics. Long departed by the time of the Renaissance, however, was the need to defend and idealize cynicism from base cynicisms associated with the street. Since the 5th and 6th century, by some accounts, Cynic sects were no longer active, medieval theologians and Renaissance humanists could appeal to Cynic philosophy as a secular mode for rejection of the materialism of this life, without having to first redefine themselves in opposition to the uncomfortable, all too material example of mendicant Cynic preacher. In places, Diogenes appears in medieval literature as a friend of poverty, virtue, and self-mastery, offering a pagan equivalent to the poverty of the apostles. He is taken to exemplify a form of resolute piety that is almost destined to be misunderstood by the ignorant. For example, John of Wales, a 13th century Franciscan theologian, describes Diogenes' virtues at length. These include firmness of soul, constancy, self-control, and the ability to suppress the vices and other cravings. Frankness, avoidance of flattery, the compassion for the suffering of others. This kind of interpretation extends to the Renaissance. In his 15th century treatise on education, the Renaissance poet Maffeo Vigio offers Diogenes as an example to the young, that they may study philosophy not for any speculative understanding it might give them, but in order to have an immediate intuition of the just and honest aims of one should have in life and how these may be achieved. Later in that century, the humanist Robert Gengin can be found sending King Charles VIII of France the apocryphal letter to Crates, remarking how astonishing it is that a cynic who lived centuries before our Lord could display so much that it is keeping with Christian law. As an oddly pious cynicism was put to work, cynic shamelessness was explained away. One approach was to claim that the occasional vulgarity of ancient cynicism was a product of the ancients' generally simpler and humbler way of life. Alternatively, cynic discharges can be explained on medical grounds. If Diogenes, a person with great severity and continence, had several times made use of Venus, it was because he felt the retention of his seed was obnoxious and damaging to him. Fair enough. This accorded with medical advice that semen should be expelled for reasons of health. Other Renaissance writers were more cautious, suggesting, for instance, that Diogenes still showed too great an interest in the body, and together with the pagan philosophy, was at best only a pale anticipation of those who would come to know Christ. Uh, Dom, Dominican and Jesuit preachers in the 16th and 17th century would nonetheless continue to draw from Cynic folklore to illustrate their sermons, focusing in particular on Diogenes' condemnation of flatterers, his temperance, sobriety, and voluntary poverty. Cynicism was also mobilized for its opposite function. It figured not only for an exemplar of proto-Christian piety, but also in the efforts to denounce apparent Christian sects. In this context, Cynic association were deemed sufficiently toxic to reject a religion sect out of hand. The hearsay of the Begards and Turlupins, who claimed that nothing that is natural should be able to embarrass us, and thereby condemned. They were dismissed for being like cynics who live as dogs do, naked and disport the shameful parts of the body. In the dictionary, the heresies published in 1969, these two sects and others are once more associated with the cynics, with cynicism now treated as a heresy in its own right and given a separate entry. Those carnal and bestial philosophers who believed that it was acceptable to copulate with women as shamelessly as a dog with a dog were imitated by the Waldens and similar heretics several centuries later. Their debaucheries copied by many who scorned all authority and blasphemed against sovereign power. Italian Renaissance humanists expanded on such criticisms, declaring that Cynic philosophy had its roots in a profound self-hatred and was the mother of fraud, hypocrisy, and vice. The Jesuit polemists Francois Jarres dismissed Diogenes as a self-conceited fool and an atheist to boot. If he lived in a barrel, it was only because he was overfond of wine. Francisco Coelho, in his 1622 attempt to determine which pagans were damned and which destined for salvation, submits Diogenes to trial in which all his virtues turn out to be vices. It seems as though the tendinous association drawn by previous figures between Cynicism and Christianity in an attempt to dignify the latter had now come home to roost. Next section. Rabelais. In addition to the pious division in Renaissance literature between those who celebrated Cynic asceticism and those who rejected Cynic's shamelessness, the influence of Cynicism on Renaissance authors led to a more playful usage. The most notorious example of this bawdy, wine-soaked work of Rabelais, which I consider here in comparative detail. Written in the 16th century, his Gargantua and Pantagruel in his grotesque comic fantasy recounting the exploits of two giants and their various associates. Most noble and illustrious drinkers, it begins, to you and none else do I dedicate my writings. Though the intended audience is decidedly highbrow, with the work permeated by cultural references and allusions that only well-educated would be able to detect, the jesting is deliberately uncouth. Diogenes makes an appearance in Book 2 of Gargantua and Pantagruel. During a visit to hell, he is found strutting about most pompously and in great magnificence, with a rich purple gown on him and a golden scepter in his right hand. The implication might be that hell for Diogenes would be a place in which he is forced to strut about in such a way. However, in his appearance has been interpreted rather differently as a carniv carnivasque. I have role reversal in which power is ridiculed by having its opponent adopt its attire. Given the thickly satirical context of Rabelais's work, it's hard to know quite what to make of this appearance. Diogenes appears once more in the prologue to Book 3, again addressed to illustration to illustrious drinkers, but also to gouty gentlemen, a disease long associated with the rich. In the prologue, Rabelais identifies himself with Diogenes, using the Cynic to frame the book that follows. Despite the obvious significance given to Diogenes, the exact role of Diogenes in framing that text remain obscure and has been subject to considerable debate. The book has itself been described by one of its foremost experts as utterly perplexing. It begins with an ending, ends with a beginning, and contains within an open-ended quest whose point is never clear and whose telos is indefinitely deferred. Weighed down by great masses or urditation and hold on one second. Wow, has it really been that long since the text have been? Weighed down by great masses or irritation and interpreted by irrelevant digressions, diatribes, anecdotes, and facetire. The quest never reaches its goal. It's hard to know precisely what the book is about. One interpretation is that mention of Diogenes forms part of a deliberate ploy by Rabelais to bewilder and provoke his readership, unsettling its attachments, upending its expectations. Oh wait, what's this? What lines it is? Two-stepping line dancing. Unsettling its attachments, upending its expectations, in a cynic maneuver designed to prepare that audience for an engagement with alterity and the necessary uncertainty that engagement will involve. Rabelais identifies himself with Diogenes in order to prepare the reader for a book that is deliberately non-systematic. Book 3 can thereby be understood in terms of cynic-free improvisation. It takes its cue from Diogenes's modus operandi, here understood as the combination of contraries and humor with subverts and unsettles interpretation as opposed to providing a method or key. Diogenes is nonetheless characterized as a friend and associate of educated people, including the illustrious readers of Rabelais. In the prologue, Rabelais adapts the following anecdote from Lucian, and thereby indicates one route by which cynicism influences his work, which, in the original reads, when Philip was said to be already on the march, all the Corinthians were astir and busy, preparing weapons, bringing up stones, underpinning the wall, shoring up a battlement, and doing various other useful jobs. Diogenes saw this, and as he had nothing to do, nobody made use of him. He belted up his philosopher's cloak and very busily by himself rolled the crook in which, as it happens, he was living up and down Cornell Hill. When one of his friends asked, "Why are you doing that, Diogenes?" he replied, "I'm rolling the crock so as not to be thought the one idle man in the midst of all these workers." In Rubilus's adaptation of the above anecdote from Lucian, he gives Diogenes books and writing materials which must be cast aside before the barrel rolling can begin. This is not only an embellishment, but it is a significant one, since it downplays the hostility to writing and reading that can be found in Laertius's Lives, as a text well known in the Renaissance. Though Diogenes casts these materials aside, he obviously has them to begin with. Once more, given the satirical context in which it appears, it is hard to know what to make of this addition, whether Diogenes has become a friend of the educated, or whether he remains hostile in some way by associating himself with Diogenes. In this example, Rubilus offers a humorous commentary on his own writing. He suggests that it might appear just as pointless as Diogenes' barrel rolling. All of it offers a little comic relief in times of war. But if Rubilus employs Diogenes as a subversive character, and not simply a comedic buffoon, his own self-consciously absurd activity as a tub-shuffling, drink-totting writer carries a more devious message, namely those who think they are engaged in more serious activities than the barrel rolling of a light-hearted satirist are the real dupes. They are unable to see the comical side, perhaps even the absurd futility of their own ceaseless labor. This is a devious implication, after all, of the barrel rolling episode. It not only suggests that the frantic efforts to mount defenses in Corinth were unnecessary and futile. The Corinthians, Jesus, the Corinthians would have been able to withstand, and it also suggests that there is also some sort of equivalence between barrel rolling and all other forms of labor. Actually, the barrel might be preferable for those prepared to endure it. Rubilus invites only the readers prepared to savor him without hesitation or doubt to drink, frankly, freely, and bodily, from his tub now filled with wine. For how much soever you shall drink forth at that faucet, so much shall I tun in at the bone. For those who deserve it, his barrel will remain inexhaustible. To the right kind of drinker, it is a true cornucopia of merriment and raillery. His book is offered as an living but corrupting draught. Though the barrel is recommended as a source of merriment, the merits of barrel rolling remain ambivalent. And since all other forms of labor are equivalent to barrel rolling, their merits remain ambivalent too. Rubilus at one point equates Diogenes' barrel rolling with the absurd task set by Sisyphus. Oh, Sisyphus, I know Sisyphus. To roll a large boulder uphill, never to reach the summit, a lesson of futility and endless labor, if ever there was one. Here, it's suggesting that we achieve little more than Sisyphus. Rubilus seems to anticipate the pessimistic outlook of the modern cynic. The, bo- the body figures prominently in Gargantua and Pantagruel as a degrading influence full of farts and whistles. This could be taken as further evidence of the role of cynicism in Rubilus's work. Such an interpretation might need to distance itself, however, from Bakhtin's influential analysis, which strays towards cynic themes. According to Bakhtin, Rubilus offers the purest example of grotesque realism in literature. The essential principle of grotesque realism is degradation. Bakhtin claims that it is the lowering of all that high spiritual ideal abstract to the sphere of earth and the body, in their insoluble unity. Degradation is understood here in a positive sense where the body achieves cosmic significance as it is reduced to its fundamentals. It is not presented in its private, egotistical form, severed from the other spheres of life, but something universal. The materiality of the body Bakhtin interprets is contained not in the biological individual, but in the uh, Borges ego. In the Borgias ego, but in the people. This is why the body assumes such grandiose, bloated significance in gargantuan Pantagruel. It comes to signify the basic oneness of all people, united by a shared materiality, by a common earthly existence characterized by the overlapping of life. Overlapping of life, death, and rebirth. For Bakhtin, this typifies the utopian aspect of grotesque realism. It also defines its comedic function, where people laugh, where the people's laughter, the laughter of body jokes and marketplace jostling, is once more admired in its baseness. Laughter degrades and materializes. Laughter attacks the narrow-minded and stupid seriousness of all higher forms of understanding and frees human consciousness, thought, and imagination. For new personalities. In Rubilus, the grotesque discloses the potentiality of an entirely different world, of another order, another way of life. That potentially it is revealed to the intellect not in the ideals or visions, but in the grotesque bodily awareness of another world, a world no longer ordered according to a false understanding of its nature. Aspects of cynic practice may be found in the above description, where cynicism also renders private matter public. It too degrades and materializes, placing the body at the center of its practice and demonstrates the possibility of another life, in a similar way that life can only emerge through through a cynic's destruction of all prevailing concepts that direct our existence and condition of our being. Yet cynicism avoids the coiling optimism of Bakhtin's analysis, which places such hope in a people or folk culture to be admired for its degradation and baseness. It avoids a point of view that bases its optimism in the assumed rejuvenating presence of nature, to which earthly people provide access. Cynic degradation do not halt in this manner to erect alternative ideals, humanist or otherwise. Bachtin strays close to another key Cynic theme when he argues that in Gargantua and Pantagruel that there is no world of iterority. There is nothing that cannot adequately be made public. Subsequent interpreters have continued that line of argument. Rabelais' text is remarkably unlike modern literature, and Montaigne's essays in its neglect of internal psychology workings of self, all that persons are in Rabelais is expressed through action, dialogue, and the body, the innermost workings of which are put on display. Once more, there are potential links to Cynic philosophy that externalizes everything that ought to be kept private, deliberately shallow, performing the operations of body and self on the same external plane. The Cynic elevates nothing and conceals little. The very features Cynicism share with Rabelais are also the distinguishing features that separate both from modern literature. Preoccupied with the inner workings of the self, modern literature generates a pretense of psychological depth, or so a cynic might claim, with readers retreating in its characteristic mode of enjoyment. Private contemplation for the cynic, Rabelais could offer a way of undermining the culture of modern. I'm going to look up this word. A characteristic of the middle. Oh, it's just the bourgeois.
Bourgeois.
The bourgeois. I should have known that. Modern bourgeois literature. Within that culture, literature operates as a moral technology, a governmental device. It helps construct and subjective frameworks within which the educated are trapped. Though they do not perceive their imprisonment as such, if Rabelais were somehow freed from the grasp of his various interpreters and specialists, he might help rupture the sensibilities that modern literature supports. With its focus on individual character formation within the complexity and richness of lived experiences, modern literature dignifies the liberal humanism of the educated by conjuring in them a sense of depth and moral seriousness. As it does so, it conveys the experience of a moral existence without necessarily specifying a moral code. This renders the subjective frameworks, its constructs, adaptable to changing political circumstance. As Terry Eagleton once put it, modern literature figures educated subjectively as an end in itself, which works apparently all by itself, and which it is its own justification. As the educated brood over the very meaning of life and enjoy the rich inwardness of their being. As they find it reflected in literature, they may adapt to otherwise perturbing circumstances, and by peacefully living within them, assent to the operations of increasingly ruinous political and economic orders. The educated will continue to adapt so long as the arts and humanities survive in some form, so long as art galleries can still be visited, plays enjoyed, and reading groups supported. The educated may express alarm at times and sign petitions, rally even, for the outlook of the educated person is increasingly an anguished one, but they will refrain fundamentally undisturbed, so long as the reflective imbecility of their educated subjectivity is provided for. Effectively, that subjective position declares if people like us can still exist in a society like this, then surely there is still hope. A cynic use of Rabelais might undermine this bleached out humanistic outlook by emphasizing the contorted psychology, philosophy, the physiognomy of the educated person. Just a second, just because I want to know how to say it.
Physiognomy.
The physiognomy. the physiognomy of an educated person. And on physiognomy's note, we're going to stop there for today. Doing pretty good. We'll be finished with this in 4 more episodes, maybe. So yeah, very good. Yeah. Very good. Thank you, and see you later.